Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 14th meeting. There are some new members here. Can I just mention that you probably don't know this, it's not in our constitution, it's a part of our long-term relationship with Keele University, our wonderful hosts. We have two ex officio members. One of them is with us here tonight. She's Professor Donna Lee, and she's the Executive Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, the largest faculty of Keele University. So if you want to know what the ex officio officers do, their role is to keep an eye on us, just in case we invite a speaker who might cause a riot. And as you know, around universities, this has from time to time been a problem. So that is part of Donna's duty. And the other ex officio member with this duty is the Vice-Chancellor. And you will, as you know, be meeting him in 2 weeks' time, and that's why we've asked you to come 15 minutes early, so that he can give us an annual review of the state of play at Keele University. So we look forward to that. So last week, we had one of the leading constitution historians of his generation, and that was a most illuminating talk. Tonight, we've got an equally illustrious journalist of her generation who's going to talk to us about the subject on the card, which includes the word capitalism. And we were discussing over a meal how popular the word capitalism might be in an audience like this. And we have to bear in mind that our guest speaker was in Davos 2 weeks ago. So she has met one or two of them in her time. And I have explained to her, I think I mentioned to her, that we may have a few paper millionaires here because of property prices within our audience, but the committee is not aware of us having any billionaires amongst the membership of Keele World Affairs, though we are open to their applications, of course. Right. So I won't go through Gillian's distinguished career. I would point out, of course, that, and I mention it from time to time, that the Financial Times does not get the press it ought to have. It is, if you study the information on the internet to find the most trusted or most reliable sources of information in newsprint around the world, Financial Times comes out with extremely high rankings for this. It's not just a place to go to find out the latest share prices. And Gillian has had a career with the Financial Times. She was their editor-in-chief in the United States for many years, and she's going to touch on that in the course of her talk tonight. And therefore, I'd like you to welcome her to talk about this taxing subject with a question mark at the end. How to fix capitalism? Can we?
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome. It's fantastic to be here. This is two firsts for me tonight. It's the first time I've been to Keele, and I had a lovely dinner earlier, learning a lot more about it. It's also the first time I've ever given a speech where the hall has been full half an hour before it started. So you're either extremely disciplined, or extremely bored, or extremely interested in the question of how to fix capitalism, or all three. And I have to confess that I don't actually remember having suggested this title, or quite why. A lot of water has passed under the bridge since we first spoke. And I was thinking on the way over here, you know, should we fix capitalism? Do we think it's a good idea, capitalism, or not? How can we fix capitalism? And where do people stand now in relation to capitalism? And I ask that because I have 3 kids, one stepdaughter and 2 daughters, one of whom is a paid-up wannabe capitalist who's got a job in an investment bank. The other one is a paid-up anti-capitalist who tells me the whole time that capitalism is appalling, and the third one hasn't yet decided. So we're about 50-50. So I'm going to start quickly by asking people here in the audience, hands up if you like capitalism. Okay, this is not a revolutionary crowd. Hands up if you think that you have personally benefited from capitalism during the course of your life. Okay. And hands up if you think that capitalism now needs reform. Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to give my views about where we are with capitalism and its many, many meanings in just a moment. But I'm going to do so in a much broader frame. That's partly because, in addition to being a long-standing journalist with the Financial Times, I ran the editorial operations in the Americas. I ran what we call our Brains Trust, our editorial board, which is our sort of thinking group for a number of years. I'm now a columnist. I'm also overseeing King's College in Cambridge. But before that, I was actually trained as a cultural anthropologist. I did a PhD in cultural anthropology based on fieldwork in the former Soviet Union. I doubt if are there any anthropologists in the audience? No, you don't look like it. Some of you may have grandkids who are studying anthropology, and you probably wish they're studying accountancy instead. I'm wondering how they will ever get a job, and I can tell you they will. Anthropology is amazing. But that influences how I look at capitalism and where we are today with the many forms of capitalism, because I am intensely interested in social and cultural and political systems, or the wider concept of the political economy. And as you just heard, I've just come back from Davos, which in my mind was without doubt one of the most shocking weeks that I've ever seen in history. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, some of the implications of that. But I've been going to Davos for many, many years. And the first time I went was in January 2007. And as an anthropologist, my PhD fieldwork research was based in, as I've said, the Soviet Union, in fact, Soviet Tajikistan, which is just north of Afghanistan, where I studied tribal wedding rituals. Now, that might seem utterly disconnected to financial markets and economics and capitalism, but it's not, because at the end of the day, we are all human beings locked in cultural dynamics with each other. And those cultural dynamics matter, whether you are a Tajik villager of the sort I used to live with and study, whether you are a Wall Street billionaire, whether you are a politician, and whether you are somebody going to Davos. Because in many ways, Davos is the global elite's equivalent of a gigantic Tajik tribal wedding. Because it's essentially a ritual which gathers people from around the world, pulls them together, enables them to reaffirm their social networks and recreate them, and most importantly, to recreate a shared worldview through a whole series of rituals, some of which are formal with PowerPoint presentations, many of which are informal. And by enacting those rituals, you don't just reflect your worldview, we actually create a shared worldview. And back in 2007, in January, before the financial crisis, after my first experience in Davos, I joked that the global elite believed in what I initially called the Holy Trinity of ideas, and then I expanded it into a fourfold collection of ideas. And those ideas were these. Globalization was good and was going to keep spreading. Democracy was good and going to keep spreading. Innovation was good and would make everyone wealthier. And capitalism, free market capitalism, was self-evidently good and would also keep spreading. That was the collection of assumptions that dominated the global elite, and which most people took for granted as being fundamentally good. Now, as it happened, I was talking yesterday to a collection of emerging market economists and leaders, some of whom come from very poor countries, and we were sharing notes on our own experience of Davos 2 weeks ago, where many of you will have seen Mark Carney stood up and said that we now face a rupture. Extraordinary dynamic speech. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. And in fact, the emerging market countries, someone from Africa was saying, well, actually, we don't quite agree with Mark Carney because, yes, for you in the pampered West, it does feel like a rupture. For us, in the emerging markets and the poorer parts of the world, we never actually believed in this kind of halo effect that all those four ideas were automatically good for everybody because they weren't necessarily that good for us. But the key thing to understand is that after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there really was initially no competition for this four-part framework that dominated global economic thinking, and by the way, also dominated the way that papers like the Financial Times looked at the world. I often joke that we are the church newsletter of the capitalist religion. But there really wasn't a competition post-1989, and there was an overwhelming belief that those four elements, in combination, were not just going to spread across the world and convert the world. The belief was that autocracies would become democratic, state-run economies would become more capitalist, etc., etc. But there was also a belief that it would boost growth and be good for everybody. Now, it's worth saying, it's not the first time that actually that combination of ideas has dominated the elite. I don't know if any of you have studied history, but one of the extraordinary joys of being in King's College in Cambridge is that it was the home of John Maynard Keynes, and we have his archives. If any of you are interested in this, come up and see the archives, they're amazing. And we have some searing, devastating letters that Keynes wrote in 1919 after World War I, when the Allies were negotiating the Paris peace, or the supposed peace deal, post-World War I, which then later formed the basis for John Maynard Keynes' famous book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And in that, Keynes describes a world pre-1914 that was uncannily similar to where we are today. Because before 1914, there had been several decades of rapidly expanding global integration and globalization. Keynes famously wrote that a man, and he actually only wrote about men, but never mind, a man could sit in his bed in London and order by telephone all of the fruits of the world and have them delivered to his doorstep the next day. That was pre-Amazon. It was courtesy of the empire, of course, the ugly imperialism. You could also invest anywhere in the world. Capital markets were integrated. You could travel anywhere in the world without a passport. You had globalization on steroids pre-1914, and you had an elite who believed passionately back then that technological revolution and innovation, in this case the telephone and telegraph and railways, coupled with free markets, were going to create an incredible bonanza for everybody. That was the overwhelming assumption. And as Keynes wrote, pre-1914, the elites felt that the world was getting so much more progressive with free market spreading, globalization spreading, innovation spreading. They didn't worry quite so much about democracy in those days, but the other three elements. They were so confident that the future was amazing that they regarded, he wrote, the affairs of politicians and small wars as mere distractions to discuss over dinner tables and be on the front page of newspapers. They did not realize that would be the serpent in the paradise. So in early 2007, the mood that I saw in Davos, the four themes that I later said were like the four legs of a table on which anybody who built their career post-1970s had operated, and by the way, I think that's most of us in the room, Those four themes were dominant, just as they had been pre-1914. And nobody then could have imagined they were about to go into reverse. But, of course, we know what happened when 1914 happened and smashed apart that complacency. And when Keynes wrote his devastating letters in 1919, he was mourning a place where globalization had collapsed, free market economics had collapsed, and I'll come on to that in a minute, and in many ways, innovation was increasingly distrusted. And the story of what we've seen since 2008, in many ways, is very similar. Because if you think of those four legs of the table that dominated after the 1970s, on which we all built our careers, a belief in globalization, democracy, innovation, and free market economics capitalism, all four of those have come steadily under attack since then. In many ways, are actually crumbling. And President Trump has accelerated that, but he is as much a symptom as a cause. What do I mean? Well, if you start with the question of democracy, there was an overwhelming belief in the early years of this century that the world was going to become more and more democratic. If you look at the Bertelsmann Democracy Index, what you actually see is that, yes, post-1989 it went like that in terms of the number of countries becoming more democratic. It peaked in 2003, it plateaued for a while, and is now going rapidly into reverse. As, to quote Anne Applebaum, autocracy is crowding out democracy, not the other way around on the world stage. If you think about innovation, what's actually happened is that, yes, we're living through an era of astonishing innovation. AI is perhaps the most vivid example of that, but standing in Cambridge, what I see every day is a golden age of science. And I cannot say that strongly enough. We are living through an absolute golden age of science with probably the richest explosion of innovation we have ever seen in history. And yet, if you look at popular attitudes towards innovation, if you look at trust in innovation, if you look at the political debate about innovation, you're seeing not just fear about AI, fear about quantum, you're also seeing in places like America a wholesale rejection of some of the most amazing life science innovations we've seen. Who would have guessed that 20 years ago? If you come into globalization, well, again, that one is very obvious. We've gone from a world where everyone was dashing towards globalization, assuming it was a good thing, to a world where, interestingly enough, the actual levels of trade occurring in the world today have not collapsed. Let me stress that. Trade is actually continuing to grow around the world. But that's primarily because right now trade is being diverted and rediverted into new supply chains, because what we've seen is an explosion of protectionism. All the tariffs, all the confusing tariffs that President Trump keeps unveiling, but not just him, it's happening across the world, partly in response, but not entirely in response. Financial market globalization is still alive and well, but it's slowing down. Information globalization has exploded in the last 20 years. It's actually been the biggest single driver of globalization if you look at measures of globalization. But you're starting to see increasingly people walling off their information systems and their internet systems. People talk about the splinter net, because there's a fair chance that in 10 years' time, China and America will have different types of internet systems. So globalization is still there, but it's definitely under attack. And of course, the really ugly face of that is rising nationalism and not just threatened tariffs, not just capital wars, but shooting wars too. But the really interesting one to think about is actually what's happened to free market capitalism. Because, as I say, after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, there was an absolutely overwhelming assumption that free market economics and capitalism had triumphed. It dominated almost everyone's assumptions when they looked at the world. And there was an assumption that that was not just dominant, partly because of the neoliberal economic revolution in the 1980s, but it would keep spreading. And what's actually happened is something very, very interesting, and something which people who were behind the neoliberal revolution in the 1970s, and by that I mean people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Jack Kemp, all of those people, something's happened which the people did not expect. And it's this. The neoliberal revolution that happened from the 1970s onwards assumed that free markets were a good thing, that they could and should be self-regulating, and that meant essentially that government should kind of stay out of the way. And the idea of government intervention, the entire idea of industrial policy, was seen as something that was generally frowned on. In fact, it was so frowned on that groups like the International Monetary Fund used to give really critical reports to emerging market countries that were talking about industrial policy. It was actually so taboo that the IMF put out a paper a few years ago called Industrial Policy, the Policy That Has No Name. And it seemed back then that, the idea of governments trying to control the economy were just incredibly retro and old-fashioned, the kind of things that happened during World War II, after World War II, or in the interwar years. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But what's actually happened, if you look at the West in the last few years, since 2008, is that bit by bit, we've had creeping, increasing government intervention in all areas of life. In some ways, it started in 2008 with the financial crisis, when governments swooped in and essentially took over the financial system in some cases, and then took over money markets through central banks and quantitative easing. Then you had essentially COVID, when governments swooped in again and became even more activist. You had Ukraine's invasion of Russia, which had an impact on energy prices, and again, governments jumped in. And then, as you began to get this growing mood of protectionism and populism and what I call patriotism, nationalism, extreme nationalism coming up, the 3 Ps, governments have increasingly been pulled into getting involved in the economies in more and more interventionist ways, particularly in places outside the UK. The UK is a bit of an outlier right now, and I'll come back to that again later. But what you've seen is that the norms around whether governments should or should not intervene have increasingly shifted. And in the last couple of years, they've not just stealthily shifted, they've dramatically lurched. And one of the biggest reasons for that, of course, is the rise of Donald Trump. Because one of the bitterest ironies on the world stage today is that President Trump came to power supposedly as a Republican. And he talked about business, he talked about markets. Lots of Republicans and lots of right-wing people thought that in some ways he was going to be part of that free market world initially. And nothing could be further from the truth. What has actually happened in the last couple of years is that we've seen in America, and now increasingly spreading across to Europe, the rise of what might be called geoeconomics or geofinance. Does anyone in the audience know what that means? No. Because again, as an anthropologist, you're taught that we're all creatures of our own environment. And if you grew up and studied in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, you wouldn't have ever been taught about geoeconomics and geofinance. Because this is a phenomena that we only really last saw on a large scale back in the 1930s. And the issue is this. If you built your career in the neoliberal economic era, as I did, as I say, Financial Times is the church newsletter of capitalism and free markets, or it used to be anyway. You grew up assuming that there was this thing called economics and the economy, and you probably learned about Adam Smith, and you probably learned about capitalism, and you had this vision in your head that the economy was something bounded, that was out there as a thing, which was separate from other things. And I say that because if any of you worked in finance, any of you ever been financial traders or worked in banking? Want to admit to it? Clearly not. Well, so financial traders traditionally have said that you have this thing called emerging markets and emerging market assets, and you have developed markets. And it used to be said that emerging markets had this messy thing called political risk attached to them. And so as a result, they were a lot riskier to invest in, but you got higher returns if it went right. And developed markets were so grown up, they'd grown out of political risk. And so you had this thing called the economy, and you had markets, which were so self-contained and so consistent as a thing that you could use the laws of supply and demand to work out what was happening and where prices should be. And the laws of supply and demand were so self-contained and so consistent that you could borrow from physics and maths and model them. So that was how we all grew up thinking of the economy. And we assumed that if you were a really grown-up politician working in Number 10 or Washington, then you'd create economic policies that were rational and focused on making you wealthier as a country, and essentially supporting capitalism. That was a dominant theory. Newsflash, that is no longer the way that economic policy making is being developed in a place like America or in any other parts of the world. Because what's happened is that the rise of Donald Trump has created a shift where instead of economics driving the show and capitalism driving the show in policymakers' minds, and in some way politics being a derivative of economics, we're moving into a world where for someone like President Trump, economics is a derivative of politics. And by that I mean, President Trump is driven by a belief, which I can talk about more in questions if you want, that it's all about power and dominance. His overarching aim is to dominate. And within that framework, he also believes he's locked in a combat with China. Within that framework, economic tools like trade policies, like fiscal policies, are tools of power, along with tools like military tools, cultural tools, tech tools. They're all jumbled together. They're all the chips on the table that he plays with. He's done that, he says, in response to China and the rise of China. And many people would argue that China has always had a geo-economic policy-making framework. It's never really believed in free markets. It's always been about politics and geopolitics and power. We can argue about that. But the truth is that right now you have the two dominant hegemonic powers on the world stage that are shifting towards geoeconomics, where economic policy making is a tool of politics, not the other way round. Or to put it another way, one way to make sense of what's happening on the global stage today is that, as I say, you've got two big hegemonic powers doing battle. China has hegemonic power, and hegemonic power is a posh word for control and dominance. Hegemonic power by virtue of the fact that it essentially controls much of the global manufacturing system because it has control over key supply chain nodes, like rare earth minerals. Any of you who are involved in manufacturing right here will know that. America has hegemonic power because it has essentially control over the world's reserve currency and financial system, the dollar. And tech hegemony is still being contested. And each side is currently trying to break the other's hegemonic power. Neither side is likely to succeed anytime soon, but they're locked in that combat right now, which is going to go on for a long time. So I can't say this strongly enough. There's been a real shift in how policymakers are imagining economics in America and China. And that has big implications for how we in the UK behave and also what we mean by capitalism. And I'll come on to that in just a moment. But the first point to make about this shift is that as we've seen this lurch towards hegemonic power fights, which, by the way, the last time we saw this was in the 1930s, when, after this period of globalization and free markets that Keynes described, the world lurched in a radically different direction and embraced the 3 Ps of populism, protectionism, and extreme patriotism, and geoeconomics. And there was a brilliant economist called Albert Hirschman who wrote about it very well. And his book was widely taught in the 1950s. If any of you had studied the 1950s, you would have known all about geoeconomics and geofinance. But it went so completely out of fashion in 1960s and 70s that no one knows about it now. But as we lurch into this geoeconomic framework, it has a number of implications. One obvious implication is that for middle powers, as Mark Carney says so brilliantly, the world has radically changed. The post-World War II order, in many ways, is dead. We cannot rely on America to protect us. We can't trust China either. The only way out, and I can talk about it in questions, is to really band together and to be very smart and ruthlessly focused on where our comparative advantages are or not. Another implication is that for companies operating in places like America and increasingly in Europe, the question today is not just about how you're going to make profits and losses or your balance sheet from an economic perspective. You can't work within the kind of framework that an economist like Milton Friedman developed in the 1970s, which said that only shareholders matter. You have to think really hard about the social and political context in which you're operating and whether you have what economists call social and governmental license to be doing your work. I mean, you can see that in an extreme way in America now, in a way that the White House is meddling, not just in national security areas, not just in critical minerals, but is meddling in all kinds of parts of the economy. It's even meddling in consumer industries like restaurants. There's a restaurant called Cracker Barrel, which had a logo change. President Trump came out and expressed a whole bunch of views about that. Suddenly, the company's in crisis. Next thing you know, because of government pressure, it's having to change its logo redesign. That's an extreme example, but elements of that are starting to impinge on businesses in all kinds of ways. So the ground is shifting significantly in America, and elements of that are starting to roll across the Atlantic, particularly to Europe, continental Europe, and I suspect they are going to come over to the UK as well. This vision we had of neoliberal economic order, which we called capitalist, with globalization, democracy, free markets, and innovation, that is in retreat. So that really raises an interesting question, which was, in fact, the title of this talk, which I realize I've ignored for the last half hour, about can we save capitalism? And the reason I said all that about the sort of way that our political economy has changed over the last 120 years is because, although we talk about capitalism, in reality, it's a very slippery concept in many ways. Because it's not the case there's only one type of capitalism out there. There are many types of capitalism. And people use that word in all kinds of ways. Some people use it to just mean business in general. Some people use it just to mean the financial markets, City of London. Some people use it to refer to the profit principle and the idea that competition and profit incentives are good for driving growth and innovation. Or some people use it in a framework that I've tended to prefer by going back to basics and say, well, okay, if we're going to talk about capitalism, let's start with somebody who in some ways actually spawned the whole idea in the first place, who is, of course, Adam Smith, our homegrown British export, British intellectual export, who's had such an amazing impact on the world stage. Britain, by the way, has produced so many amazing intellectual exports that we should all be much prouder of it than we often are. Now, if you go back to Adam Smith and look at what he actually said, it's quite interesting because back in the early years of this century, I was covering the financial markets for the Financial Times, and I'd often go around talking to bankers and financiers and say, what drives you? What's your framework to explain what you're doing? And they'd often say, we believe in free markets, we believe in Adam Smith. So I went back and had a look at Adam Smith. And as many of you know, Adam Smith wrote 2 books, not one. One was Wealth of Nations, and the other was A Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the Wealth of Nations is the bit that bankers love to love, because it's all about the idea that ruthless competition, free markets, if you let it rip, they will become efficient, productive, drive innovation. That's good. That's the Wealth of Nations argument in a nutshell. And that's basically what people like to talk about when they try and justify capitalism, particularly financial capitalism. But if you look at the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which Adam Smith wrote before the Wealth of Nations, that basically argues that in order to even start having commerce or markets, you need a number of things to make it work. One of those things is access to the market. You need to have people who are actually able to take part in the market and trade. You need to have democratic access in many ways. You need to have access to prices. Otherwise, you can't really have a market. Sounds obvious, but as I come on, it's not always honored. You need to have a sense that people who are engaged in risk-taking actually have skin in the game. And that point's really important because when Adam Smith developed his vision of what might be called capitalism in a very rough sense, he was operating in an era when really the only types of economic companies around were family-owned firms. In somewhere like, the Potteries, you know all about this, the power of family-owned firms. But if you read the financial pages of the Financial Times, you have the impression that capitalism is all about listed, quoted, public companies. But that didn't exist in Adam Smith's day, except for the East India Company, which he hated. Family-owned firms were pretty much the only game in town. And the point about a family-owned firm, as some of you who might work for family-owned firms know, is that you have skin in the game. You can't go taking wild bets without it hitting you personally. So, skin in the game was part of his vision, and of course the other aspect of it, as the name of the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, suggests, is that he also believed you had to have a shared moral framework to create enough trust to make markets work. Now, what's very interesting is if you look back at what was happening on Wall Street or the City of London before the 2008 financial crisis, most of those elements were missing. It was very hard for ordinary mortals to get access to the financial markets in funky instruments like derivatives. You couldn't actually get access to most prices. Many of the people taking really big bets were not actually the people who had real skin in the game, and the shareholders who did have skin in the game didn't often have the foggiest idea what the banks were actually doing. And as for a shared moral framework, well, yes, it's sort of been there, but it was pretty wobbly in places. There was a real sense of elitism and separation amongst the people who were driving much of the system. And so I would argue, and I've actually told many of the bankers this, that actually pre-2008 you didn't really have proper capitalism on Wall Street in the sense of an Adam Smith-type capitalism. And in fact, if you look across the country as a whole, and if you look at the last 15, 20 years, many aspects of that original sense of free markets and functioning, effective free markets have been at best under attack, sometimes entirely disappeared. Not just on Wall Street, but in many other parts of the economy. And that raises the question, as we see this big lurch in how we're imagining the political economy, as we see the rise of geoeconomics, the rise of populism, protectionism, patriotism, as we see a world that in some ways is going back to what we saw in the 1930s, where does capitalism fit into the equation? No one's saying right now that they want to go to a fully state-controlled system. Not even in China are they saying we want a fully state-controlled system that's completely anti-capitalist. But nor is anyone right now, even on the right, saying that they want to go to a Milton Friedman vision of capitalism that's all about shareholders and nothing else. One of the things that's incredibly interesting about the right-wing voices today is that as they attack ideas like ESG and, forms of climate and all those kind of social activism, for the most part, they're not calling for a return to Milton Friedman. They're actually saying they want to respect different types of stakeholders around companies, like national security interests, like populist concerns, like right-wing cultural values in America. So what does capitalism actually mean? And is there a way to reimagine it in a positive way, given where we are today in the world? I know I haven't got much more time, so I'll just say a couple more things. One of the ideas that I find quite interesting to try and think about capitalism and to realize there are different ways of imagining capitalism is actually to look beyond the West to a country where I lived for many years of my life, which is Japan. Because I don't know if any of you ever worked in Japan, but they call themselves capitalist. They've gone through highs and lows, big lows for a long time. But they've always had a very different sense of capitalism. It's always been much more about stakeholderism in a wider sense, where they've been very aware of not just the need to make profits, but also the need to look after employees, the need to be aware of their footprint in the community, the need to think about their suppliers, and also to think about national interest in a wider sense. And there was a time when Western bankers scorned them, and said, how ridiculous. But it is a different vision and model, and it might be one way to start reimagining where we're trying to head now. Because another way to frame what's going on is to think that all of the trends I've talked about, on the one hand, are very scary. Rising populism, rising protectionism, rising extreme patriotism. That's all pretty scary. And it can lead to some extraordinarily dark outcomes, as we saw in the 1930s. But you can also flip it on its head and say, actually, all of those can also have benefits too, particularly if we start reimagining capitalism towards more of a kind of almost Japanese-style model. For example, populism. Yes, having policy driven by mob rule, angry mob rule, is scary. Governments make bad decisions. You tend to end up with nasty robber barons and autocracies and things like that. But populism can also be about actually respecting the needs and interests of popular people, ordinary people who are not tycoons, and trying to listen to them and recognize that a world of growing income inequality is inevitably going to lead to populist anger. And you need to recognize that and try and deal with it. And one of the really interesting things that's happened in the last few years is that the far right, the populist element of the far right, the MAGA base in America, here, parts of the Reform Party, are actually starting to talk about policies that look quite similar to the far left. And that is really about a sense of populism connecting it up. And it's not all bad. In fact, we could learn from some elements of populism and think how to address them or address the complaints. Patriotism, or nationalism. That's very much on the rise in many parts of the world. As I say, the UK is a bit of an outlier in this, but patriotism can be terrifying. It's what drove the 1930s. We can all agree that ugly nationalism is bad. But pride in your country, a desire to work together with your community, a desire to be rooted in your country and contribute is good. And I'm very influenced by the fact that my husband's Danish. Are there any Danes in the room? Anyone else married to a Dane? Yeah, if you are, you'll know that patriotism in Denmark is quite different. Because on somebody's birthday in Denmark, does anyone know what happens? You give each other flags, and you send flag emojis. Because you're so damn proud of being Danish, you want to celebrate it. When you come back from a trip overseas at a Danish airport, the people who come to pick you up, and they do pick you up in Denmark, they come waving the Danish flag. Can you imagine that in Britain? Can you imagine people standing up and saying in Britain today, I am so proud of being British, it is so fantastic, I want to help everyone in my community and my country, that I'm going to send you a Union Jack on your birthday to celebrate. I mean, you're laughing because we're used to basically trying to knock Britain all the time. But a sense of pride in country, if it's not directed towards hating others, is good. We should harness that today. And even protectionism has an upside too. Because yes, ugly tariffs and tariff wars of the sort that Donald Trump has unleashed are terrible. I'm not going to defend those for a minute. But saying, actually, let's look at what's happened to local communities because of extreme globalization is a good thing. Saying that actually we don't want to outsource all of our jobs all the time to the lowest cost producer with terrible human rights standards, that's a good thing. Saying actually we're not going to import from countries with not just appalling labor standards but terrible environmental practices, that's a good thing. There are seeds of what's going on that could actually be beneficial. And the biggest point I want to leave you with is this. The very fact that we're going through this traumatic period at the moment on the world stage, the fact that I've just come from Davos, which was shocking in many ways, where the Americans basically did a reverse takeover and were not just aggressive about the need to dominate, but basically had pulled off the mask and did not even pretend to have an ideological frame. It really was just about power, about dominance, about making money. The fact we've had that shock, the fact that the UK and Britain, the UK and Europe is going to have to wake the hell up very, very, very fast and get its act together and get serious about military defense. And I hate war. I've been in war. I hate it. But we have no option now except to hurry up and invest in our military and get ready to defend ourselves, I believe. The fact that we've had Mark Carney stand up on a stage and say the shocking truth that we're at a moment of rupture and we cannot go back to where we were 10 years ago, and middle countries are going to have to band together and get serious. The fact we're living through that shock is terrifying and dark, but also gives us an astonishing moment to step back and say, what do we want? What are our values? How do we want to organize ourselves? Do we want neoliberal capitalism, we've just seen? Do we want a Japanese style of stakeholders capitalism? Do we want to go down the path of geoeconomics in the 1930s? We don't have the option, and I wouldn't want to go down the imperialist capitalist model we had pre-1914. Or do we want to find something else? And when I think about finding something else, I go back to Adam Smith again. Because, as I said, he wrote 2 books. We only ever look at the second one, The Wealth of Nations. But the theory of moral sentiment says we need a shared moral framework, an ethical framework that binds us together as a community to create enough trust to make markets and business work. That is a bit that has been ignored in recent years, and that is a bit that we have to focus on. It's about putting communities and humans into our economic models. Because our economic models, which treated the economy as an abstract thing in the neoliberal era, those aren't working right now anyway. So we might as well get serious about putting humans and communities into our vision of the economy. And to remind you why, I'll just leave you with this. If you look at the roots of the word economics, I don't know how many of you know about this, it comes from Greek, oikonomia. It originally meant household management. It's why some of you might have studied home economics at school. Ever think about it? Why did you study home economics? It wasn't about spreadsheets and inflation rates. It was about cooking. That's why. Economics, the roots come from oikonomia, meaning household management. That is one vision of capitalism, which is much more positive and community-focused. Or if you want another example, think of the word company. Does anyone know where the word company comes from? Probably many of you worked for years at companies and have no idea what your word actually means. Okay? It comes from Old Italian, meaning con panio, with bread, which sounds totally weird, but the reason is that the original companies were groups of people who came together, had lunch, and did commerce. Again, putting communities and humans into that vision. And the last one, which is my favorite one, having lived through the great financial crisis, is probably the most obvious. The roots of the word credit that drive so much of financial markets and so much of our vision of capitalism come from the Latin credere, meaning to believe or trust. And if nothing else, that should remind you that if you want to have a vision of capitalism where credit markets work, you have to build trust. You need both books of Adam Smith. And that, in my mind, is the best way to restore capitalism. So thank you. Did you feel that way?
Thank you, everyone. Let's get cracking with. I see we've got many questions on the table. Thanks to the stimulus that we've obtained from Gillian. And starting off with Diane Miller's question, she says she'd like to hear a bit more about your experience of Davos. I don't know whether she's thinking about the food or the company, but would you like to give some impressions? Because I don't know if anyone else here been to Davos? No.
Yeah. Okay, Davos is an absolutely weird event that is both utterly venal and grotesque, and at times quite inspiring and very exciting. And the main reason I go is simply because it is where so much of the world's power brokers and elites meet, and you get a very good sense of where the world's heading as a result. This year's Davos was unlike anything I'd ever been to before because it was completely dominated, quite deliberately, by President Trump. Essentially, it was a takeover by America that symbolized the wider takeover they're trying to unleash. Not just because on the promenade, they took over the entire church and turned it into the USA House with a very angry big eagle overlooking everything. But also because the entire first few days were dominated by will he, won't he show up. And when President Trump finally did show up, he just took over everything and basically engaged in an exercise of ritual humiliation for the Europeans, was absolutely scathing about the Europeans, and in private, the Trumpians, and I've known a number of the Trumpians very well for years, are just completely scathing about the Europeans. It sort of dovetailed with the tech bros and the tech oligarchs who are absolutely on a similar, path of dominance and power projection. So those two things very much dominated. But what was interesting was that Trump was also engaging in a kind of ritual humiliation display for his own business leaders. And one of the most extraordinary moments of the whole thing was when Trump gave his speech. And to get into the speech, you had to queue up through quite a narrow door. And so what you had was basically the world's billionaires and all the mere millionaires crammed together, fighting each other, jostling to get through this narrow door. And these are people who are used to flying around the world on private jets and getting anything they want instantly. And suddenly they were having to cram together and sneak through together in this really uncomfortable, it looked a bit like a sort of social experiment or reality TV experiment from Love Island, where you're subjecting people to maximum discomfort. And they finally got into the hall, and then they had to wait. And then Trump came in and gave this very long, somewhat incoherent, rambling speech that went on for about an hour and a quarter. And everyone was trapped in there. I must admit, I fell asleep for part of it because it was so repetitive. And I'd also heard it all before. And then there was a supposedly special meeting or special cocktail party for all these CEOs. So they all crammed out again into this tiny space and waited. And they were left waiting for 2 hours until Trump deigned to show up. And so some people like Jamie Dimon basically threw a tantrum and just left. Most of them didn't. And that is a display of ritual humiliation. And the way I think that you can understand Trump is that he behaves like a Tudor king, or like, Louis XIV in Versailles, where he basically runs the American government like a court. He expects his courtiers, he plays them off against each other. Power depends on your physical proximity to the king, not any bureaucratic org chart. And people are either so aggressive that he feels scared of them, like China, and basically goes head-to-heads and back down, or he expects them to act like vassals. And that's what you saw in Davos. The other thing I have to say, two more things I'll say, is Mark Carney's speech was brilliant. Absolutely standing ovation. By the way, Trump barely got any applause at all. Mark Carney's was literally standing ovation. It was a talk of the week. I've known Mark for years, and I used to say his best speech was the tragedy of the horizons he gave about climate change many years ago. But this one just blew it out the park, and he wrote it himself. He believes it all himself. He's very articulate. And the last thing I'll say, the most important thing, is that because Trump dominated, it squeezed off the agenda all the stuff we normally talk about, which is like climate change and things like that. But away from the razzle-dazzle dominance, there was actually a lot of really important, meaningful conversations happening around things like climate change and stuff. I took part in a number of ventures to do with things like water, which is something I'm very involved in. And we made real progress putting people together from different stakeholder groups. And although climate change was barely mentioned in public, the good news is that almost none of the CEOs I spoke to have actually stopped their moves to try and combat climate change internally. They're just not talking about it in public anymore. So we've gone from a world of what I call green washing to green hushing.
I'm going to talk about Carney, I'm going to talk about Trump, and I'm going to talk about climate change, because you've mentioned them all. So we got questions here. Let's start off with Carney. A couple of questions from Hugh Gladhill and Paul Hemingway. So Gladhill says, brilliant and terrifying picture of the world. He wonders whether Carney's speech will change anything. And Paul says, well, while Carney was commonly considered to be the grown-up in the room, 75% of Canadian exports, according to him, go to the USA. So how is Carney going to handle Trump in the event that the guns are turned north?
Okay, let me start with the second point, which is that Mark is incredibly aware of the vulnerability of Canada, but he also knows that he has some cards to play himself, in that America needs Canadian oil and gas. And so, and by the way, a lot of the American auto supply chain is integrated with Canada. So yes, America has most of the cards right now, but Canada has some big cards too. And that's the first point to make. Second point to make is what you need to know about Mark Carney is that he is a former investment banker who knows that when the financial markets move, they move. You can't bargain with them. It's reality. And he recognizes reality as it is, not as he wants it to be. And that means two or three things. First of all, he is willing to be pretty aggressive and tough with Trump. He got elected over Chrystia Freeland partly because he has this macho image. He plays heavily on his ice hockey history. This elbows up, for those of you who know about ice hockey, is his whole great meme. He's also ruthlessly willing to diversify and cut deals with China or anybody else. But he's also very, very clear-sighted about the need for middle powers to get real, get smart, get united, and try and act together to provide a counterweight. That's good news, I think. Yeah, and basically, the thing that was shocking about his speech for Europeans was he kind of said what everyone sort of knew and was feeling, but hadn't dared to say out loud. And the way that I understand what's going on right now, it's like the 5 stages of grief after a bereavement. You probably know that psychological thing where if grief happens, you start off in a state of shock, you then have bargaining, anger, denial, and finally acceptance. And Carney is at the acceptance stage, let's get moving and get on. I think until recently, most Europeans and the British government have been still going around that 5-stage cycle.
About Trump, but not specifically about what he said at Davos, but more generally. So Anne Plant wonders whether you think Trump was actually a man of destiny for this time. I think she means a product of this time. Was he a sort of inevitable, unavoidable, a requirement for some reason? Pete Holdcroft wonders whether his skill is that he forces European leaders to act on agendas they'd rather ignore. And Stephen Booth puts it rather differently. He doesn't see it as skill at all. He says, is America politically an amateur compared with the approach of China to geonomics?
Okay, 3 very good questions. On the last one, I'd argue that actually China has been playing America very cleverly and not only has faced America down and forced Trump to backtrack repeatedly in recent months, it really has, but it's been far more clear-sighted in planning for this moment of confrontation than America. To give you 2 examples, anyone who's ever lived in Japan knows that about 10 years ago, Japan and China had a fight, and China responded by curtailing the exports of rare earth minerals to Japan, which was a huge shock. So the Japanese rushed out and spent a huge amount of time stockpiling and preparing to make themselves less vulnerable next time round. So you would have thought that the Americans would have noticed and prepared. And I've been kind of obsessed with rare earth minerals for a long time, particularly magnets. And one of the things I do is I spend quite a bit of time with bits of the American military, talking to them. I was down about 10 months ago in Tennessee with a large number of American military, and in fact, European and Asian military too. And the issue of rare earth minerals came up, and it became clear that, and this was before the China-US row, that the American companies were completely unprepared for having rare earth minerals choked off. And even parts of the military were very unprepared. And I was shocked. And China's been preparing for these strangleholds for a long time, and it will use it very cleverly. Another example, very pertinent, is that if you look at the AI race right now, which I think is still being contested between China and the US, to get AI to work, it's not just about having brilliant people and huge data sets and training sets and things like that. You need masses and masses of energy. China is racing ahead with its provision of energy on a stunning scale. I mean, it's like leaping ahead of America so dramatically, because it's not just installing, yes, unfortunately, coal plants and gas plants, which are terrible. it's also quadrupling, doubling, quintupling down on renewable energy too. It's basically going with every single energy source it can do. And it's just like streaks ahead of America. President Trump is trying to smash apart the renewables business at a time when America desperately needs renewables. And so I do think that China's outplaying the US right now. In terms of, is Trump a man of destiny? He certainly believes it. No question there. As I say, I think he's as much a product as much a symptom as a cause of what's going on in a bigger way. And he certainly acted as a major catalyst. And I don't think we'll have another person quite like Trump when Trump finally departs. But Trumpian impulses are not going to disappear anytime soon. And the question about whether this is forcing the Europeans, the silver lining is forcing the Europeans to grow up. Yes, about time. I wish they'd grown up earlier. As somebody who's been deeply involved with Ukraine for many years, frankly, 2014 should have been the moment that Europe woke the hell up and got moving, and they didn't. And that is frankly shameful for the UK and for the rest of Europe.
I'd like to turn to climate, which was part of your sort of recent conversation. And we got several questions around this, and it's the dichotomy with capitalism. So it's expressed in different ways. Ian Duerdoth, so compared to the 1930s, do you think that overpopulation and global warming, climate change actually sort of make any difference to capitalism? Stephen Booth, is innovation just expansion for innovation's sake? He says it's not always good. So it doesn't actually, you talked about the moral purposes of humanity, so he doesn't necessarily think innovation always serves that. Bob Winter, he says, no, we'll come back to Bob Winter in a minute. Roger Hartley, can capitalism cope with with climate? And Graham Daly puts it a different way. He says, is a definition of capitalism maximize consumption? Because if that's what it's all about, if that's its only purpose, what's the future for our planet? So actually, do we need to, could we argue that because it's about increasing consumption per capita, that it ought to be abolished rather than fixed?
Okay, 4 small questions there. Okay, I happen to think capitalism is not just about increasing consumption, it's also about increasing production. The two go hand in hand. Yes, if you are gobbling up more and more resources, then that absolutely is oppositional to climate preservation and stewardship. What makes it a bit complicated, though, is that innovation often has the ability to create more production without gobbling up as many resources. So just think about what's happening today with, say, AI or social media, all the all the things that are happening there. We have seen an astonishing increase in energy efficiency of usage in the last few decades, and that's likely to just increase. So I don't see it as a straight line or straight oppositional situation. To me, the simple, obvious thing you have to do if you want to bring climate into any vision of capitalism is start pricing for nature and start pricing for carbon. And, frankly, carbon pricing should be as ubiquitous as interest rates in corporate plans. And things like water should have a price, a proper price that recognizes how valuable it is. That is going to become increasingly an issue, because what people don't realize about water is that you can't have an AI expansion without water. You need electricity, but you also need water. And the need for water has barely been addressed yet. There's a desperate need for a radical overhaul of water systems around the world. Sitting in Cambridge, to cite one example, the politicians keep saying they want to make Cambridge this massive, great Silicon Valley science destination, blah, blah, blah. We have the intellectual chops to do that without question. We might even get our transport system sorted out one day. But the biggest single impediment to Cambridge going to the moon as a gigantic Silicon Valley science park is, if you can believe it, the lack of water. We don't have enough functioning reservoirs to build all the new houses. And in a country where it rains the whole time, that is shocking. So, the climate versus capitalism is about policy, frameworks, and choices. What were the other ones? Sorry, I've forgotten.
No, let's move on to Adam Smith. I was intrigued you described him as a British economist. I was hoping
Scottish economist,
there were no
sorry.
Scots in the room.
Yeah, apologies to anyone who's
shout out.
Scottish. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
St Andrews will kill me.
But what? Sorry, I've lost. There's a question here about, yes, it's about small businesses, and you talked about them being family businesses. So, on the one hand, we've got that model that you're presenting to us as a good model for the future. But on the other hand, as John Bourne says, how dangerous is it for the Western economies for so much of the financial power to be in the hands of so few people? So is your model of so at the end of all these questions, is your model of capitalism able to cope with the fact that we've got a few dominant players? Is it 5 companies that have got more than the gross national product of Western Europe? There's some remarkable statistic of that nature. Could you explore that with us?
Absolutely, and it's a burning question, and the answer is I don't know. Because, capitalism works, to go back to this vision of Adam Smith, when you have free access to markets and free access to market prices. And that means it's basically anti-monopoly, robber baron behavior. And there's this constant tension in capitalism that as companies grow up and become successful, they begin to become a winner and control more and more of the market. They become dominant. And you then know that they're going to basically try and become a monopoly if they can and squeeze out competitors. And that undermines innovation. So for that reason, places like America have had what they call the Bork doctrine for many years, which means that you have antitrust, that if you start seeing consumer prices going up because there's a monopoly, then you know there's some kind of antitrust problem and you clamp down. And Britain's had a version of that as well in recent years. There are 2 problems right now around that. One is that you are seeing the development of increasing concentrations of corporate power and wealth and stock market listings or stock market representation. And so stock markets are becoming more and more concentrated, and corporate sectors are becoming more and more concentrated too. And governments are becoming more and more pathetic in terms of trying to break up monopolies. And that's a huge problem, really huge problem. And as you get, politicians in bed with big companies, and when they start wrapping themselves in the national flag and saying, you have to defend us because we are the national flag carrier. If you don't let us become big and dominant as a tech company in America, China's going to overtake us. That's what's happening today in Silicon Valley. They're wrapping themselves in the national flag. Then you begin to get less and less appetite for actually dealing with antitrust. And you see that in Europe and in the UK, because when they try and attack big tech companies and say, this is an abuse of monopoly power, you immediately get into a diplomatic war with America because President Trump regards tech as one of the chips on the table to bargain with, along with economic policy and trade policy and everything else. It's a big break from where we were 30 years ago. So you get massive concentrations of power because government and business is becoming entwined, and that crushes competitors, and it's really, really bad. And frankly, in my view, is really anti-capitalist. The other issue, though, is AI, because the speed and scale of AI development now is going to quite likely lead to more concentration of power in a way that's potentially very alarming. And once again, small companies, startups, family-owned firms are the lifeblood of a flourishing capitalist economy. They don't get reported in the financial press. It's very hard for a newspaper like the Financial Times to report on anything other than big listed companies, because big listed companies do things publicly and visibly, and you can see their stock price, and they give statements, and so you have a story. Small companies are so diffuse and amorphous and private that it's very hard to write about them. So the way we write about the business world is completely skewed and distorted. But if we don't find ways to ensure a vibrant startup, small company ecosystem, then we don't really have what in my view, is either proper capitalism or, a vibrant economy.
May I mix metaphors? This Adam Smith invisible hand was attached to a body that I think perhaps was standing on a level playing field. And Sally Richardson, therefore, asked, she mentioned small shopkeepers and businesses are trying their hardest. UK government keeps hitting them hard with national insurance and so on. And so she feels they should be supported. But I think that the point about this question is also that these large organizations that we've been talking about, that are in the hands of the few, the multinationals, the tech companies, the perception would be that they're not taking the strain, such as these small businesses are. Would you like to give a general view about taxation of these major players compared with what the burden on these admirable smaller capitalists in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the situation right now, in my view, is grotesque because big companies have the accountants and heft and ability and political clout to play all kinds of tax games. They can move their stuff offshore. They have people advising them on how to use transfer pricing to reduce their tax bills. Or if you are a really big company and you have Donald Trump behind your back, you simply rip up an agreement that was made a couple of years ago to tax multinationals and tech companies in different jurisdictions. And they literally just ripped it up internationally. So that's one big problem. I think the other problem is, and I've been very frank about this, I think Rachel Reeves' first budget was completely mad. I believe very strongly that we need to plug the tax hole. We need to take in more taxes, unfortunately. The only way to do that in a transparent way that will build credibility and give some sense of consistency and be least distorting is to simply put 1-2 pennies on the income tax. Doing that is no one's favorite, task, but at least people could have understood it, understood what's coming down the track, and you wouldn't end up in a situation where you're constantly bargaining between different interest groups, all trying to fight each other. You have these weird distortions, like with the farmers. National insurance was mad. We have to create more jobs, not less. We should actually be cutting national insurance, in my view, not increasing it, precisely for these reasons. And the other thing, which some of you may disagree with, because I know it's not very popular, is trying to impose more taxes on wealth creators, i.e. the wealthy who are investing in finance and companies in places like London. Imposing more taxes on them in a way that means they're all going to leave is completely bonkers, because we're taking away the people who could actually drive a lot of investing and growth in Britain. And it's very distasteful to see billionaires essentially, creating their tax systems in ways that means they don't pay as much tax as other people necessarily as a percentage. But the hard, realpolitik reality is we need those people in the country. We should not be driving them away because they actually fund a lot of our startups. I feel it very strongly. But I know, plenty of people at a place like Cambridge will say, why shouldn't they all be taxed up the wazoos? I understand it, but the reality is, and the thing that's particularly dumb of what she did was the changes to the inheritance tax laws, because it's grotesque that billionaires create offshore trusts and then don't pay a lot of inheritance tax. But a lot of that money's been earned outside the UK, and it's very simple. If you threaten to tax that at 50%, they will all leave. And they have. Many of them.
Protectionism. So we've got some questions here wondering whether the UK should actually start to protect some of its manufacturing industry. So have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a really difficult one because right now, in many of these global conversations, Britain looks like one of the last believers in neoliberalism. And it's very odd because we have a very open economy, open trading system. We've not been particularly protectionist at all. We let foreigners come in and invest in just about anything, buy up all our companies, asset strip. We don't keep a lot of, tariffs on imports or exports. We're acting as if we still lived in this wonderful globalist, collaborative, neoliberal world. That's kind of how we're acting. And we've kind of failed to notice that most people around us are no longer behaving like that. And so, frankly, Britain ends up looking a bit like the Boy Scouts versus the mafia when it comes to dealing with America. Because, we keep saying, don't put tariffs on, we won't put tariffs on our stuff, And yes, you can come and buy anything you want, and yes, we'll let you buy up all these companies. Americans are coming over and buying up the AI companies and the quantum companies and all the life science companies, all the things that should be driving growth in the future. And they will drive growth in the future. They'll be in the UK, but they'll be owned by Americans. And we don't stop them. The free market, neoliberal, globalist, in me that I was trained to be, for the last 30 years at the FT, still believes in the idea that free markets are good. The realpolitik observer in me right now fears that if the UK doesn't wake up and get tougher, it's going to end up being, cleaned out. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that probably, unfortunately, holding our noses, Britain is going to have to start reciprocating a lot more. And I wish that wasn't the case.
On your models of capitalism, you mentioned Japan, which was a very attractive example of stakeholderism. And we've got some questions here that are really asking, where on the spectrum of the possibilities do you think Britain can go, and when can it go? Can it do it now? So I think Jeff Elliott is asking whether that stakeholder capitalism is really a form of company socialism. Whereas we've got a question from Joe, who's wondering, she's rather hinting that it's sort of passé.
What, capitalism or Japanese capitalism?
No, the Japanese
stakeholder capitalism.
Is Japan still a good model for today?
Well, here's the thing, is that 15, 20 years ago, people thought Japan was a disastrous model. Because if you look at the history of Japan the last 50, 60 years, there was a period in the 1980s where it looked like Japan was dominant and about to take over the world. And management consultants like yourself were telling people to go and copy the Japanese production systems. And if any of you worked in the auto sector, you know that there was always copying of Japanese systems. And then the Japanese economy imploded when the bubble burst, and everyone said, well, actually, Japanese approaches are really bad. And they are. There are aspects of Japanese capitalism that are really bad. It can lead to crony capitalism, back-scratching, inability to price money correctly. You pour good money down bad holes. It's got lots of bad things in the past. It can be very inefficient. And so everyone said, oh, Japanese capitalism, terrible. Write it off. And the reality, like everything, is that there are good things and bad things, and we can all learn from each other. And what is good about Japan today is that, one, companies have a wider sense of duty and responsibility to their communities and employees. So to give one tiny example, everyone right now is saying, what are we going to do about the fact that AI is coming and we have to retrain lots of people, not just at school, but in the middle age and old age? How are we going to retrain people? So you could say, well, it's up to the individuals to do it themselves and to pay for it themselves. You could say that government should do it, or you should say that companies should do it. And in Japan, they've actually started doing the latter. So in a company like Mitsubishi Heavy today, you can't get promoted unless you've first done an AI skill course paid for by the company. That's a vision of capitalism which is actually very rational, in my view, very needed. It's diametrically opposed to the neoliberal vision that's been knocking around in the last few years. Do we want that in Britain? I don't know. But think about it. Who is going to pay for us to learn AI skills? Who should pay? Is it going to be entirely individualistic, winner takes all? How are we all going to learn how to do that? Or to give another example, Japan has a very strong mechanism for pain sharing. So when I was living in Japan during the Japanese financial crisis, and all the banks were collapsing, I got pulled in to see, because I used to run the bureau in Tokyo, I got pulled in to see the CEO of a big bank who said to me, our profits have collapsed by 20%, so we have to cut everyone's salary by 20%, and my salary will be cut by 40%. So I went, wow. And he said, yes. If this had been Britain, probably you'd have everyone's salary cut by 20% and maybe 10% layoffs. If it'd been America, you would have had 40% layoffs and the CEO would have had a 20% pay rise. And I tell that story because actually one of the biggest questions in the next 20 years is going to be, do societies have the ability to share pain equitably without starting a revolution? Because, Britain's fiscal situation is bad. There's going to have to be nasty cuts somehow, and pain sharing. In America, even more so. Do we try and lob the pain onto one small group, like farmers or like small business owners? Do we have the ability to sit down and have a grown-up conversation about how to share pain?
Consequences of rupture. UK's situation, and Alistair Duncan voices the same question as some other people as to the position of Britain relative to Europe and what the implications are of these stresses. So does Britain need to get closer to Europe in some ways in this sort of this long-running post-Brexit trauma that we've gone through? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I know I won't be popular with many of you by saying I think Brexit was an unmitigated disaster, because not only did it rupture so many trading links and cause an economic shock, but what was equally disastrous was that it distracted politicians from talking about the underlying structural issues plaguing the British economy, and meant we all spent, it's a bit like a divorce, where everyone spends all their time arguing about the terms of divorce and forgets to actually look at how the kids are doing. And we just took our eye off the ball of all these really big structural problems for 10, 15 years. It has been a disaster. I cannot say that strongly enough. Productivity has collapsed. Investment in key parts of the infrastructure has collapsed. We're drifting. Animal spirits have been completely crushed. And you overlay on top of that the financial crisis of 2008, which knocked out a core part of one of the motors of the British economy. And we're in a really bad space. I cannot say it strongly enough. So I'm not saying we should necessarily, we can't wind back the clock. We have to be realistic, like Mark Carney. But I think that one, we absolutely have got to get close to Europe militarily right now. And I've been trolled a gazillion times when I go on BBC or Newsnight and say this, but we are at war. And we are fooling ourselves if we do not stand up and realize that we are in a hybrid war right now with Russia. And you just have to look at what's happening in cyberspace, seabed cables, all the disinformation campaigns, the fact they're putting bombs on the railway lines in Poland. Most of this stuff does not get reported. But believe me, I was with the head of MI6 in Davos, and nobody who looks at what's actually happening on the ground should fool themselves for a millisecond that we're not at war, because we are. And we are utterly complacent and blind to this. And I give a lot of talks to the students saying, wake up and smell the coffee. Yes, it's lovely. I have been in wars. I started my life in a war correspondent. I hate war. But we cannot pretend that we can all live in this kumbaya, cuddly world where we all want to be pacifist and not use our universities and intellectual capital to get serious about defending ourselves. We have got to get rapidly up to speed with military tech. Unfortunately, I hate it. We have to do it. We have to collaborate with Europe very fast. We have to use the fact that we have real strengths in parts of this complex to work with. The Danes are amazing, the Norwegians, God bless the Norwegians, God bless the Finns. The Finns are absolutely incredible. If Alex Stubb was ruling the world or ruling Europe, we'd be in a much better position. The Poles, thank heavens for the Poles. And we need to work with the Ukrainians. Frankly, at this point, we need the Ukrainians as much as they need us in terms of military tech. And I say that as someone who's been very involved in Ukraine for a long time. So we have to do that on Europe with military stuff, and we also have to get serious, I think, in terms of making it easier to have trade and financial service alignment. Not because we want to adopt all of the European laws, blah, 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 but we have to basically remake our trading relationships and remake them better, in my view. And I know many of you may disagree, but...
I want to finish in sort of two connected areas. Linda Sherwood is appreciating what, and as the rest of us are, the fact that you've explored different forms of capitalism with us, try to describe it in different ways. She wonders whether there are other forums anywhere where this need for change to capitalism is actually being discussed. She thinks it's not happening in the UK. One suspects that they don't discuss it at Davos because they probably think they rather like capitalism. So is there any chance of any other discussions elsewhere taking place? And Jessica wonders whether socialism might play any part within any capitalist model, because that's a word that hasn't come up this evening.
Yeah, well, socialism is increasingly popular if you look at the polls of young people. As I say, I've got one daughter out of 3 who is definitely marching against capitalism. And, you know, there are aspects about the idea of having governments allocate resources to prevent extreme inequality that sound really attractive right now for many people. And there are aspects of the idea of governments owning parts of the infrastructure that also sound very attractive. Having lived in a supposedly socialist communist system, though, I harbour no illusions about how ugly socialism and communism can be. I think a lot of capitalism can be ugly. A lot of socialism and communism can be ugly too. And so, you know, I'm not saying that's an answer either. What I would say, though, is that, you know, AI potentially is going to change the equation a lot, not just because it means that suddenly there is no capacity constraint, and suddenly the potential output on small amounts of resources can be absolutely extraordinary, and productivity could potentially increase dramatically. But it's going to raise really big questions about what you do with people if they can't find jobs. You know, how do you redistribute? The tech barons spend a lot of time thinking about how they're going to prevent the pitchfork scenario, where suddenly, if this carries on in this path, you're going to end up with lots of dispossessed people storming the citadels. And that's a very frightening scenario. It really is. But also, you know, if you believe that AI is going to have the ability to run all kinds of complicated programs in a way that we've never managed to as humans effectively, then maybe it is possible to allocate resources more effectively than socialist systems have done in the past, or even market-based systems have done in the past. I mean, the idea of distributing resources via either market pricing or by government fiat assumed that the capacity constraint was humans. If you get a super brain that can scan the entire globe and send electricity to where it's needed without relying on a slow price mechanism or some central bureaucrat, maybe that changes our vision of capitalism all over again.
I'd like to end on a British sort of political area. This comes from Jane, and we can reflect on the fact that we've had a series of prime ministers of varying capabilities, all the way via Liz Truss through to the current incumbent.
Bad, very bad, worse.
Well, where did you start? Did you start with Johnson?
No, I didn't know. Yeah.
No. Okay, well, anyway, I think the question that Jane is getting at is thinking about wanting a positive form of capitalism in the future that you think would be suited to the United Kingdom. She's wondering who we should vote for, which politicians. Are there any out there who get it?
Okay, let me turn it around, okay, because I'm not going to fall into that trap and say instead, let's look at places where there is more trust in the government and capitalism. I mentioned Denmark before. Denmark's fascinating. They were a disaster 40, 50 years ago economically. They turned themselves around in about a decade. You know, you can turn yourself around. And they've discovered this sense of national pride, massive entrepreneurship, high levels of social cohesion. You know, if you want to go anywhere right now, go to Denmark and work out how they did it. By the way, they also had a very tough immigrant policy, which again might say a lot about maintaining social cohesion. So Denmark's fascinating. Switzerland's fascinating. Part of my family is Swiss. And the idea of delegating democracy down to the local level and having a sense of ownership is critical there. It really is. And they have both a combination of great libertarian ideals, where it's real personal responsibility, but also a sense of being obligated to look after each other in the community. And that's, again, something we could definitely learn from. And real local democracy. That's amazing. I'm a huge fan of Singapore because There are aspects of Singapore that are very authoritarian and dreadful, but they have two really interesting things. One is they pay their civil servants properly, so they get the very best of the best going into civil service and politics. And they have the ability to do proactive industrial policy. So they plan for the long term in a way that's amazing. If you answer the question of who's going to pay for AI training, in Singapore it's the government. And they're doing it across the board. I mean, have any of you been offered an AI training course? By anyone yet? Well, you have? Who from?
Well, it wasn't offered to me, but my daughter-in-law just paid £2,000 for an AI course.
Fantastic. That's commercial. That's a kind of individual, if you like, capitalist model. You go train yourself. But the question is, who's going to train us? So I don't mean to duck the question as to who you should vote for, but what you should do whenever you think about voting is realize that there are other visions and models that we can learn from beyond what we're stuck with today.
I'd be grateful if you'd sort of keep your seats, because Gillian has a 3-hour journey back to Cambridge, so let's give her a head start. We've had a wonderful evening exploring this complex topic of capitalism. I can't think of anyone who could have done it better tonight than Dr. Gillian Tett. And if you want to show some appreciation, apart from in the usual way, you might want to stand up and say, "I'm proud to be British." Well done.